I want to begin with two important acknowledgments. First, I want to thank the lecture series organizers, led by Marissa Parker, Melanie Marie Haywood, for putting together this lecture series. Decolonization of knowledge is an overdue theme. Please give a big round of applause to Marissa Parker, Melanie Marie Haywood, Stella Mguli, and the other organizers that worked with them. Second, I want to recognize the presence at BCU of a long inspiring academic since our very brief doctoral student days at BHAM prior to the 2010 shuttering of sociology, Professor Kahindi Andrews. To begin this lecture, I ask, what is coloniality and how does it apply to the academy? Maldonado Torres noted that, quote, patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that defined culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration, survives colonialism, unquote. He suggested that coloniality, quote, is maintained in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. Unquote. If the ways in which academics currently generate, transmit, and preserve knowledge continues to preserve coloniality, then those ways require decolonization. As Medina Lostanova and Walter Mignolo put it, quote, decolonial thinking brings to the foreground a silenced and different genealogy of thought. The colonial option originated not in Europe, but in the Third World as a consequence of struggles for political decolonization, and in the heart of the U.S. as a consequence of the civil rights movement and its impact on decolonizing knowledge. Unquote. Yet coloniality is currently reasserting itself politically through ratification of Senate Bill 83 in the northern state of Ohio, a Great Lakes state separated from Canada by Lake Erie, just as it has reasserted itself politically in the southern state of Florida. Following Antonio Gramsci's 20th century explorations on power, I suggest that it might be helpful to equate seeing coloniality with seeing hegemony. In this neo-colonial New World Order, joint UK-US military needs generate shared cultural logics that serve to bind a system of states to a globalizing corporatism. My pre-academic experiences during the early 1980s as a former U.S. Air Force assistant historian for the 964th Airborne Warning and Control Squadron, or AWACS, opened my eyes to the maintenance of UK-USA empire, or hegemony of coloniality. Later, I completed my MPhil in criminology and sociology at Bangor in Wales, my doctoral study on Garrison State cultural logics that began in 2010 at the University of Birmingham until the closure of the sociology department just 3 months later was completed at the University of Huddersfield. Examining the history and legacies of British colonization and slavery in present-day United States of America, USA, especially the predicament of African Americans in that context, and exploring how it has and continues to influence USA's cultural and socio-political behavior remains a key concern for my ethnographies. For example, the first president of the Continental Congress, the first government of the independent colonies, was the slave trader Henry Lawrence of Charleston. This lecture emphasizes the notion that seeing coloniality is necessarily a visual activity and an essential precursor to decolonizing what needs to be decolonized. Yet Danny Jorgensen cautioned earlier in 1989 that participant observation of social phenomena, such as coloniality, is a humanistic and unpredictable form of fieldwork. In 1996, John Rieger averred that, quote, photography is well suited to the study of social change because of its capacity to record a scene with far greater speed and completeness than could ever be accomplished by a human observer taking notes, unquote. Sarah Pink recently noted, quote, that we have seen rapid changes in the ways visual ethnography can be practiced over the last 20 years. As personal, digital, and connected mobile technologies and media become ubiquitous, images were embedded in our social activities and encounters, inextricably woven with our personal identities, narratives, lifestyles, cultures, and societies, unquote. Ignoring land claims by a variety of nations comprised of indigenous North Americans, over 300 years ago, the British Crown planted 13 crown colonies in North America. They were planted here as corporations. British Empire swiftly replaced Native American sovereignty. In the next slides ahead, I revisit USA's revolutionary period to speculate on the extent that the USA today and American academia might reflect a neo-colonizing project. This lecture then asked the same about the 1947 UK partition of the Indian subcontinent. Finally, in the wrap-up to my lecture, I turn to the implications of my call for seeing coloniality in the academy. USA is not just a geographic area of natural resources. USA is also a cultural landscape that includes, according to the Cultural Landscape Foundation, quote, cultural and natural resources associated with an historic event, activity, person, or group of people, unquote. That historic event and group of people are the British colonists in North America, who increasingly demanded a voice in Parliament to defend their rights as Englishmen until tensions spilled over into open rebellion, which quickly morphed into a war for independence. USA's founding myths reflect this cultural landscape, where it is popularly held that British colonist and slaveholder Thomas Jefferson's 1776 writing of a Declaration of Independence sparked a mass rebellion to monarchic rule by non-slaves in 13 North American British colonies. Monarchy was deemed an illegitimate form of government on par with dictatorships, drug lords, and other despots, and may indeed have inspired the French to overthrow their monarchy less than 3 decades later. The popular view that this rebellion by British colonists in North America was ultimately successful followed from former British soldier and slave plantation owner General George Washington's defeat of British General Cornwallis, who was promptly shipped to Britain until his reassignment to India, where he successfully resumed waging British Empire. Nonetheless, another important writing, also penned in 1776, suggests a different narrative and continues to fly under too many radars in the academy. Employed as a wordsmith by the British Secret Service, Edward Gibbon wrote the first volume of his The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was promptly shipped to the North American colonies. In a time prior to radio and television, long and difficult to read books were not only welcomed by the literate, but also read. Gibbon noted in his early form of information warfare, or IW, that the Roman Republic's foremost feature was its longevity. Gibbon's theme left many colonial nouveau riche divided over the future role of government between Jefferson's Iroquois-inspired federalism, consecrated in USA's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and Gibbon's Romanism. The 1781 adoption of USA's first Constitution made no mention of a republic, stating in Article 1 that the style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America. Further, USA's first Constitution did not embolden slavery, but instead echoed the Declaration of Independence. For example, enslaved African American Mum Bet, also known as Elizabeth Freeman, overheard those words that all men are created equal. And the Articles did not stonewall her successful 1781 suit before the Massachusetts Supreme Court for her freedom. Nor did the new Anglo-American nation immediately institutionalize removal of indigenous Americans. The Articles, as USA's first Constitution, also made it very difficult for the infant nation to wage war, requiring consent from at least 9 states. Although many contemporary historians continue to maintain that the Articles were weak or ineffective at running government, the Articles worked well at preventing wars, protecting the tax-paying classes from funding unwanted military interventions, and not disallowing enslaved African Americans to sue for freedom before state courts. I suggest those strengths were major reasons the Articles were plotted against by a Gibbon-inspired faction of ultimately successful counter-revolutionary political elites, desirous of a strong central government on the model of Rome. When the delegates to the 1787 Articles of Confederation Convention at Philadelphia met in secrecy, it was for the express purpose of making amendments to USA's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. This event is remembered today, mistakenly I suggest, as the Constitutional Convention. 16 of the 55 delegates who attended did not sign the Romanist document, and Patrick Henry, who smelt a rat from the beginning, later demanded the Neo-Romanists be investigated as a conspiracy. The repercussions and cultural transmission of the secret deliberations at the 1787 Articles of Confederation Convention continue to resonate today, as too many in the Academy are unaware that the original form of USA's first national government was relegated to 10 amendments to that later Romanist form of government initially conceived by the British Secret Service. As Niall Ferguson recently noted, quote, like Rome, the United States would expand, unquote. The result was not only the development of an interventionist state, but also a North American and later global empire, ultimately serving coloniality. Rather than helping the Chinese Kung Fu fighters in their liberation efforts from British Empire, this slide illustrates the US Marines instead waging British Empire in China in 1900, side by side with the colonized from the Indian subcontinent and their colonial masters, amongst others. Power rarely works by force alone. I lament the contemporary disinterest in the debate initiated by Charles Beard in 1939 as to whether USA's second Constitution, the one currently in use, was a consciously crafted document to enrich USA's new class of nouveau riche on a British Secret Service supplied model explicitly based on the Roman experience. Since then, USA has a long history of elected and unelected rule by a class/caste of nouveau riche that solidified over time into a garrison state, marching hand in glove with empire. Now, I wish to focus our attention on the Indian subcontinent, especially under British Empire and its so-called independence in 1947. In the slides ahead, I revisit the 1947 UK partition of the Indian subcontinent to speculate on the extent that India, Pakistan East, now Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka today might reflect a neo-colonizing project. Before querying the 1947 partition of the Indian subcontinent by British Empire, we should ask, when did a British foothold in India begin, and how did it unfold to establish dominion? These questions are key because a sociological bridge between the old and the new can often be discerned, especially by examining, to quote Harvey in his Grid of Spatial Practices, quote, how individuals or powerful groups dominate the organization and production of space so as to exercise a greater degree of control, either over the friction of distance or over the manner in which themselves or others appropriate space, unquote. So to paraphrase Harvey, in the arena of social conflict and struggle, commanding and producing spaces reproduces and enhances power. Distance is both a barrier to, and a defense against human interaction. It imposes transaction cost upon any system of production and reproduction and the domination of space. Unable to see impending betrayal by Mir Jafar, Siraj-ud-Daulah was defeated at Plassey in 1757 by the British East India Company led by Robert Clive. Siraj-ud-Daulah's capture and execution ended Bengali sovereignty, which marked the beginning of British Empire in India. Of this lethal visual glitch suffered by Siraj-ud-Daulah, Henri Lefebvre explained, quote, people look and take sight, take seeing for life itself, and seeing can be turned into a trap, unquote. Visual sociology and attention to coloniality and cultural landscapes allow us to see conflict, competition, and dominance at a level not usually noticed. For those whose focus is decolonization, there are two essential questions. The first is descriptive. Who or what is where in coloniality? The second is analytic. How and why did the Bengalis become famished? Tirthankar Roy explained that, quote, 1770 famine owed to a combination of harvest failures and the diversion of food for the British troops, unquote. British Empire expanded rapidly during the early decades of the 1800s through an administrative device known as subsidiary treaties. Britain protected the territories of each local native prince from invaders, but the local prince's foreign relations were controlled by the British. By 1849, the British had annexed Punjab and transferred administration to British officials, which caused resentment among newly unemployed former bureaucrats of the middle class. In Meerut, 3 Indian regiments were court-martialed to 10 years in prison after they were previously ordered by their British masters to to bite off the animal greased cap on a cartridge and refused. Eating pork is prohibited to eat in Islam, same as in the Hebrew Bible, and the cow is sacred to Hindus, so that Muslims and Hindus were both defiled. Now, most of the court-martialed Indian soldiers were stripped of their uniforms and placed in shackles. And as they were marched off to jail, the court-martialed Indian soldiers berated their comrades for failing to support them. The next day, the chastised Indian troops broke into revolt and killed their British junior officers who attempted to stop them. This reaction morphed into the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Prior to this rebellion, these British colonies in India really didn't warrant much attention from taxpayers in Britain, or warrant much interest from even potential immigrants from the UK, simply because these colonies held few British settlers. It wouldn't be until the opening of the Suez Canal a decade later, which shortened a 3-month voyage from India to Britain down to 3 weeks, that British businessmen and utilitarians stopped seeing the cost of shipping goods from India to be prohibitive. Declared Empress of India by Disraeli in 1876, by 1878, a Russian military expedition to Afghanistan sought to challenge Queen Elizabeth just beyond India's northwest frontier. When they saw 3 British armies march into Kabul from India, the Russians fled. Queen Elizabeth's Anglo-Saxon Empire was not seriously challenged until additional slights and provocations directed against Indians in 1919, including a new constitution, produced reactions. After heavy-handed Anglo rule during the First World War, by 1990, Mohandas Gandhi transformed India's Congress Party into a nationalist movement that rivaled the Anglo-Saxon administration in many areas. Increasingly, the Congress Party claimed to be the one representative party of all Indians, which alarmed some Indian Muslims. As a result, the Muslim League was formed, eventually led by a barely practicing Muslim and London-trained barrister, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The League pushed for partition of Muslim-majority areas from India as a separate nation. Mohandas Gandhi's eventual willingness to accept Muslims within an undivided India saw him become the target of disinformation campaigns such as Muhammad Gandhi, until he was assassinated by a Hindu extremist. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Naturam Vinayak Godse in 1948. World War II left Indians further traumatized by heavy-handed wartime Anglo rule and left Anglo-Saxon Empire too weak financially to continue empire. But India was too big to leave undivided. Just 500 years ago, India was richer than all of the countries of Europe combined at that time. So it behooved British interests to see India divided into eventually 2 independent states and the Dominion of Ceylon. Later, East Pakistan broke away to become Bangladesh, and the Dominion of Ceylon became Sri Lanka. Today, the governments of all 4 parts are independent republics on the model of Rome. Gibbon likely would be pleased. I began this lecture by listing a series of seldom questioned events in the founding history of the USA that suggest the Academy might have lost interest in the contributions of Charles Beard, Eric Foner, and others on decolonization, imperialism, and global predatory capitalism. Perhaps if we improve our critical ways of seeing coloniality, we can overcome the most significant obstacle, which is coloniality's preference for anonymity. As former president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah first explained in 1965, quote, the essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to it, is, in theory, independent and has all the trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system, and thus its political activity, is directed from the outside, unquote. Seeing beyond the trappings of international sovereignty carried out by CIA, which was born in London, by the way, in 1947, MI6, and even the Peace Corps, to discover what lies behind their public images and goes unseen, is necessary to identifying what must be decolonized. With that, I conclude my call for seeing coloniality in academia. Thank you, and I want to now stop sharing my screen.
Say thank you so much for the enlightening presentation. It was very, very knowledgeable. So for the next session of the Q&A, I think it should be Q&A and you should write. So are you happy for the attendees to raise their hands and contribute or ask any questions?
Yes, that's fine. I think the Q&A will be the most productive part of this presentation or workshop.
If
Okay.
anyone has any question or any comment, please feel free to raise your hand and we can go from there. Oh, we have a comment from Lucy. So Lucy is saying, interesting to think of the word anonymity in this. Coloniality being unknown and invisible. This is giving me things to think about.
Yeah, thank you. That was the whole purpose of this lecture, was to just get us to question the obvious, the things right in front of our very noses that we never even think about. For example, in the first slide, what is that? Is that familiar to anybody? It should be familiar to students and faculty at BCU, but it's a lion. And then I made references in additional slides to lions and even a Bengali tiger, and to point out that there's a symbolism associated with lions and tigers, that they are a trophy that colonialists love to put up on their walls and on their flags and fly over their universities. And there aren't any lions and tigers in Britain, and yet the English football team calls themselves the Three Lions, which I thought was more appropriate to Kenya. But these are things that we don't even think about, and they're around us all the time. They're part of everyday life.
Thank you. We have a question from Romain. So Romain is saying, I have a question. Robert, have you looked into the links between Fanon and Ashi's Nandi writing in the Indian context? Example, the intimate enemy. I am keen to consider transcultural experiences of colonized human experiences or live worlds.
Yeah, so when I was briefly at the University of Birmingham as a doctoral student in sociology before it was shuttered, Nasmanian was a big faner, or sorry, a big fan of that scholar you just mentioned, whose name that quickly escaped my mind. But that was his. So Kahindi Andrews was inspired by Malcolm X's perspectives. He was inspired by the guy you just mentioned. And God, I can't. Even the title of his book is on the tip of my tongue. He's somebody whose work is on those lines, and he probably has done more in the Indian context than I have. I'm still exploring the Indian context. I just made my first ethnographic fieldwork trip in November to the Indian subcontinent. I'm studying the Zemindar in West and East Punjab, so just outside of Tobatek Singh, and I am in collaboration with Murray Leaf, who did one 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, 100 miles east, so on the same latitude. So we want to do some comparative over time looks at what's happening to farmers who own their land. These farmers are known as Zemindar. I think I'm straying from The Wretched of the Earth. That was the name of his book, Fanon. That's the name of the guy who wrote it. Finally, I answered the question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Ishita, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk. I had a question because I'm from India, and a lot of the things that you were saying made a lot of sense. So the talk is called "Seeing Coloniality in Academia." My question is sort of, once you do see the coloniality, what steps do you take next? Once there's acknowledgement of the fact that there is a heavy colonial influence, what do you do next?
That's actually another talk, because this talk is just seeing
Yeah,
what needs to be decolonized.
yeah,
There was talk recently before the American Anthropological Association about things that can be done to address coloniality, and I just thought it didn't see deeply enough. It didn't see the trappings of coloniality in all its attire. It only saw parts of it, and I think that talk more than anything inspired me. But um, this is something that is still being debated um, within the different academic disciplines. What is the best way to decolonize? And I would I would say that you have to begin with seeing coloniality. How can we decolonize something we can't see?
yeah.
So in India, there's so many layers of
There are.
coloniality after 300 years of British Empire, and then the neo-coloniality since 1947 partition. It's the same with the other parts with Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. These parts are are in a state of neo-coloniality. Nobody knows the citizens in these countries. They don't have truly representative government. Their governments must toe the line of the New World Order. And who is at the top of this New World Order? A certain royal family is still at the top.
That's right. Could I also maybe ask a follow-up question if that's okay?
That's okay.
Yeah. I think one of another talk that I was sort of that I attended, it was sort of it was the same thing along the sides of decolonizing the humanities, and the decolonization was coming through knowing within the museums. So it was sort of looking at the British Museum and the different various art galleries it had. And I think then it was tying back to how we want to decolonialize the curriculum. And one such power hierarchy that you can see is that even when we're sitting in a classroom, what happens to be so is the fact that there's a person that's teaching us and there are students. That in itself I find is very, there's almost like a power imbalance there, right? So when we're seeing coloniality and when we're seeing decolonization, it also matters in the actual structures that we study in live or that we live in. You can see it, you can see nuances of it in small spaces like your classroom. And then as a student, because I'm currently a student, I'm studying in the UK, and it's very funny because I can see this in India as well, but I can also see this in the UK. And it's been interesting to see how the power dynamics are also very different. So when I'm asking the question would toe the same line of when we acknowledge the coloniality and when we're seeing, or even when we're saying decolonialize the humanities or academia, when the structure in itself is the sort where a person sort of, teaching you, or classrooms are built in a way where there's an imbalance, how do we sort of shift that, if that made
Well,
sense?
no, everything you said makes sense, but not everybody sees what you saw and what you just described. So you can't shift something that you don't see.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of the whole movement for state schooling in the UK that began 200 years ago. It began in reaction to the importation of the Madras monitorial method from India by Quakers. Now, you have to understand that when we talk about British Empire and we talk about the British, we're really just talking about a voting 3%. The other 97% of the inhabitants of the British Isles had no right to vote. They could not vote. The way you got this right to vote was on election day, you displayed your knowledge of Greek or Latin. Though that's indicated that you had been to a grammar school and you understood the ways of Roman Empire, and that therefore you could vote for a member of parliament. If the only language you could speak or even read and write was English, then you couldn't vote. So the laws that were crafted by Parliament until 1867 were laws crafted by this grammar schooled 3%. And the British people themselves suffered these laws right along with the rest of the world, which is why you have such an exodus of people from the British Isles. It was a nightmare to be a British citizen without the right to vote. But when the Quakers borrowed the Madras monitorial method and called it the Lancaster method, it allowed one man through a system of monitors with 10 students under him, and they're all students, but older students are in charge of younger students. It allowed one person to teach 1,000 kids to read in English. They saw in the Madras mosque, they saw the same thing. Indian students learning Arabic Qurans, recitations in Arabic, and they don't even speak Arabic in India, and they were learning them word for word and reading them. And they're like, wow, if they can do that with a foreign language, why can't we do that with our Bibles with English? So they attempted it and it worked. Well, this alarmed that voting 3%. Oh my God, they're learning to read and write. Elizabeth Fry went into the prisons and was teaching women to read and write within weeks. It was easy to go to prison back then. All you had to do was maybe snatch a loaf of bread from a shop because your family has been starving without food for a week. Off you go to jail. And back then they charged you room and board for jail. So you couldn't get out until you paid your room and board. That's why the Tower of London, a famous prison, produced so many famous writers. You couldn't leave unless you paid your room and board. And writing was about the only way you could earn an income. So the 3%, they're alarmed. Our folks are going to start reading that stuff from America. And then they're going to come after our heads the same way that the French did against their aristocracy during the French Revolution. They really, really got panicky. They go, what are we going to do? And the response was the invention of state schooling. State schooling in Britain was invented to control what people would read and to slow down how fast they would learn to read. A child's mind, an average child's mind is like a sponge until the age of 10. And if you look at the way state schooling works today, by the time you're 10, your eyes are dulled over. You don't want any more of it. And reformers have since pitched in and tried to push state schooling in different directions, progressive directions that have been helpful, but it can't get away from its coloniality, which is to control what people read and to control how fast they read. And so that's why you see classrooms organized the way they are, with masters in front of students. And you don't see the way they were organized in Madras as circles, with people sitting in a circle. Nobody's sitting in the middle of the circle, just a circle, and everybody taking turns. I think they call these circles halakas, HALAQA. I think that's what they call them. And yeah, so India had a different way, and but that way was not conducive to elitist rule by voting 3%, and that's why you see it in the manner that you see it now, and it something about it is rankling you. You just, this doesn't seem right, and it isn't right. I would agree with you. Next question.
We have another comment from Romain regarding, I think, Ishita's question. Ishita, I think there is no solution short of dismantling the entire university itself. It's so institutionalized. I think that was
I can
in
talk if you
reference
prefer.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah, sure.
Apologies for the casual get-up. It's just been a long day at work today.
That's okay.
No, but I was very interested to hear your talk. Thank you so much for that. We are looking at decoloniality from, at an institutional level, but the institution itself is a product of that mindset. And the ways in which we reproduce knowledge, it seems almost inescapable from this. So I always recall and always kind of think of Tuck and Yang's, metaphor by the decolonization isn't a metaphor and cannot be a metaphor, but that it's being treated as such by it being a tick box or something we have a committee about or something we do some nice initiatives about. But then my worry is that just allows, let's say, the beast or whatnot, to continue just with a few corrections put in and actually creates the source of the inequality. Something that Zizek writes about too. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is how can we look to short circuit this? And I don't expect an answer. I'm kind of leaving that as an open question. Thank you.
So Romain Chenet, right? Romain Chenet. Okay. Merci.
It's Romain Chenet, but yeah, that's fine. Very good.
So I'm asking myself these questions as well, and I find myself returning to those prison notebooks compiled by Antonio Gramsci. I think we need to go back to the class argument that that Karl Marx identified. Karl Marx was, he's an underrated ethnographer. This guy was an immigrant to London in the 1840s, just 20 years after the Luddite movement was violently suppressed in the Yorkshires to the north. And he's in London. He's writing newspaper articles for a New York newspaper. So, and he was writing about London. So he has a very ethnographic eye on what's happening around him. And his analysis of what he's seeing, I mean, this 3%, this voting 3% that doesn't allow the other 97% to vote, they call themselves capitalists. What we do is capitalism. It's a wonderful thing. It's free enterprise, and so he calls them capitalists because they call themselves capitalists. But when only 3% are allowed to do economic activity at the exploitation expense of the other 97%, that's not free enterprise. That's exploitation. That's a racket. So I find myself in agreement with Gramsci that we need to go back to the class, because British Empire is by a 3%. And it opens up new possibilities. And then so that we don't get apathetic, there's nothing we can do about the institutions. Well, we're doing something about it right now. The digital age has opened new possibilities for us.
As well as new oppression, so it's about kind of adapting.
Even though I know how hegemony works. I know that they're constantly monitoring us and molding us and shaping us and steering us, so that, you know, we're like a school of fish. We're unpredictable because some of us go up and down, some of us go side to side, some of us go in circles, but they're always trying to channel us down that canal, right? And maybe over the waterfall. But that is how the hegemon works. He knows that he cannot directly control us, so he shapes us and steers us. But I don't know. I'm not going to give up. So I used to do a sport. I used to be an amateur boxer, and my trainer, Napoleon Campbell, told me, there are 9 ways to skin a cat. You just have to think of the other 8 ways. And this is funny. I wasn't even an academic yet, but that has stayed with me. I'm always trying to think of the other 8 ways. So I don't think apathy is a possibility for me.
Thank you so much, Robert. No, I'd agree. I guess it's, as I said in the chat, but maybe you don't see it, it feels a lot of the time that it's about finding the motivations and the methods to help us not give up, right? To continue to find the pathways and opportunities that will have meaning and that will kind of sustain that. So thank you again.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We have a comment from Kathy. Kathy is saying, the tiger photo is astonishing. Hunting trophies were brought back to upper class households, used as rug tiger skins, or hung on the walls, symbolism for colonialism and power.
Yeah, so she just made that observation. She didn't have a question.
Yeah, because I think as you are presenting, Kathy's here. If you're happy to voice your comment, that's okay.
So yeah, you talked a bit about, we were discussing photography really as a way of embedding colonialism, and just when you start to, like, you showed that photograph with the white men and was it a tiger or in front of them?
It was a lion.
Was it tiger was in one of them, or?
Well, yeah, there was a tiger in the last one.
Yeah, I was thinking about that one, and no, it just made me think all about that notion of, you know, movement, travel, going to geography, really taking things from those places, hunting, shooting those animals, and then bringing them back as kind of, you know, very kind of expensive trophies to decorate the home. You know, it's a kind of symbolic, everything is a kind of symbolism, isn't it? that goes back to the colonies for the white man, the upper class white man.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned semiotics.
Yeah.
Henri Lefebvre.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so it's
I
just,
think there's a lot of work to be done in visual methods and
Yeah.
linking them with these theories.
I do. I think John Tagg has done some quite interesting work. But I edit a journal on photography, actually, called Photography and Culture. And so we're always looking for new. I'll write it in the chat. Or if
Great.
anybody wants to do a special issue, or because we did do one on colonialism. I think it was about 10 years ago with I've forgotten her name now. So it would be great. I'll put the name of the journal in anyway. Elizabeth Edwards, I think it was. Elizabeth Edwards is the one I was thinking. She wrote a book on colonialism and photography, and she did a special issue. But I think it really needs updating those ideas. So,
Kathy,
here's my
I'm
note.
going to give you my email address.
Okay.
I would like to contribute something to your
Oh,
journal,
great.
perhaps.
Thank you. So, do you want me to write my email in and you can email me?
There we go.
Oh, you've done it. Thanks a lot. Okay, that's brilliant. I know, I really enjoyed your talk. Thanks. So
I'm glad you liked it. It's very provocative. In America, I'm disturbing long cherished founding myths.
I can imagine. Yeah.
They to claim that the British got this country back after a mere 11 years with a second constitution conceived by a wordsmith in the employ of the British Secret Service, that's rankling. They're going to say, well, what about the War of 1812?
Yeah.
What about Andy Jackson? Well, if you examine that closely, and I don't have time to discuss that today, but that could have been a phony war.
Yeah. Yeah.
A phony war that made the British look good to the Native Americans who lived in what is now Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and that were pushed out by the encroaching Yanks spilling over the Appalachians. And the British, we have your back. But they didn't. They were pushed across the Detroit River into what is now Ontario, Tecumseh. The indigenous Ohioan leader was, they say, killed at Amherstburg.
Yeah.
And now all of the Native Americans are on that side of the Great Lakes. And the British are looking good. We tried to save you from those bloody Yanks. And the bloody Yanks now have all of Ohio. And Indiana and Illinois, they have what was called the Old Northwest Territory, completely cleansed, as they would put it, cleansed of indigenous peoples.
Yeah, but they present it as some kind of heroic.
And it wasn't until I moved to England in 1995 and began teaching history there that there is no War of 1812 in British history books. It's something that only Americans know about.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Crazy, isn't it? It's crazy just the construction of it all and
And this War of 1812, the so-called War of 1812, the displacement of indigenous Americans to the Canadian side of the Great Lakes, it empowered this new Yankee nation, empowered them in the eyes of the French and the Spanish, and with Jay's Treaty, previously signed in 1795, these other colonial powers knew that you don't mess with the United States. The United States just defeated Britain, so-called defeated them.
Yes, interesting.
But I think since the second Constitution, since the ratification of the second Constitution, that and the ratification began in 1787, just 11 years after Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, that they pretty much got us back. And like I said earlier in answering another comment or question, the CIA was born in London
Gosh,
in
didn't know.
1947. If you look at that closely, everything about it is it's on the model of military intelligence, Section 6. Everything about it.
Surveillance as well, isn't it? You know, which goes back to
And yet, if you were to suggest that there was a British Empire today, or that it was, or that it's American powered, like, what are you talking about? It's gone. But it isn't gone. If you look through the lens of neo-coloniality, it isn't gone. And how is it that Yanks, who fought 2 wars, they say 2 wars against British Empire, are hand in glove, side by side, at least since 1900, with the mother country doing British Empire?
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, so that's the problem when you start asking questions like this. And then, of course, Americans are all brainwashed. They hear founding myths since the 1st grade, and history is repeated every year for the first 11th grades of schooling, and then in the 12th grade, which is their last year of secondary school, which they don't have A-level college. They just have high school and then 4 years at university with no A-level college in between. So they just get the same story, and it just gets fatter and fatter and fatter every year. And then in 12th year, they learn American government.
So that's it, brainwashed in a way.
Yeah, it is. It's indoctrination with myths. And how dare you question these myths? I mean, it's a tight. I think it was Robert Bell, the sociologist, who noted that this Americanism is a religion of nationalism.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you very much. So,
and then I tried to extend this thinking to, well, let's look at this nation building that took place in the Indian subcontinent. If you ever go to a football game or a cricket game between a Pakistan team and an India team, you would never know that they were all Indian just 100 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. And I enjoyed that. I'll be in touch about the journal or an article.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll let someone else have a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert, you have a question regarding, so Imogen is asking if you could say more about the world order.
Oh, the New World Order?
Yeah, sorry, the New World Order.
That was something that Daddy Bush said in 1989. When the Berlin Wall fell, he said, "It's a new world order." And that's been another one of my remits, is studying the Bush crime family. So, in 1977, he was director of CIA. When I was in the military, before I joined AWACS, I was in a communications squadron in Alaska when Jimmy Carter was president and my commander in chief. But he was director of CIA in 77. And then Carter lost election, and the next election he lost to Reagan. And people don't remember this, but Reagan took office in January 1981. So the election was in November 1980. And Reagan won that election and took office in January 1980. Within weeks, he had been shot by a good friend of the son of his vice president. Ronald Reagan's vice president's son's friend shot him. Ronald Reagan's vice president was George Bush Sr. That son was Neil Bush, and that friend of Neil Bush was John Hinckley. So when we heard about this in Alaska, we right away made jokes like, oh my God, the vice president tried to knock off the president. And but maybe I don't know that we should just have joked it off like that. That's like a little too close to comfort. That would have left Bush running the country had he died. He didn't die because, and I've read the Wikipedia account, and it's not the way I remember it. The way I remember it is that this biology professor at Mount Union University today, Mount Union University, but not, back then it was Mount Union College. His son, the Professor Rodman's son, was interning as a surgeon in Washington, D.C. And this guy, his reputation as a heart surgeon since has just it's national now. He was eventually pinched from the Canton, Ohio area, and they have him over in Aspen, Colorado. But he's called the methodical Dr. Rodman, and he saved Ronald Reagan's life. And when Ronald Reagan mended, he claimed he had Parkinson's disease. He couldn't remember things very well beyond 3 months. And so him and his wife, Nancy, just stuck to Air Force One, flew around the country giving speeches. And in effect, George Bush ran the country for the next 2 terms of Ronald Reagan's administrations. George Bush hated Ronald Reagan. He hated his voodoo economics, he called it. Couldn't stand anything about him. So we've had 12 years of former CIA Director George Bush. Those two 4-year terms as Reagan's vice president, when Reagan really didn't try to run anything because he didn't want to get assassinated attempts again. And then the 4 years where Reagan ran, or sorry, when Bush ran. So yeah, I don't know if I might have gotten away from the question now.
So, hi, Robert. I guess I just wanted to try and understand the relationship between the New World Order and colonialism. Is there a connection between the two? Is it colonialism on steroids? What is it?
I would go back to Kwame Nkrumah, and when Bush said in 1989 it's the New World Order, it was the same neo-coloniality that was going on in the 60s. It was the same coloniality before World War II, but now they're using puppets. Look how many regime changes take place in Africa and the Middle East. The so-called Arab Spring could be viewed quite differently than the way it is popularly held. It could be viewed as regime change on the cheap, especially when you got CIA bots pretending to be people. And we're organizing here and we're meeting there. And all of a sudden, you have a regime change. That's regime change on the cheap. That didn't happen in Libya. That was very expensive. They had to spend a lot of money doing that because the internet was shut down. But anybody who goes against that New World Order, if you suggest you're going to sell oil in any currency except the US dollar.
You made a reference to oil, and I asked you, is that the situation in terms of Venezuela? Is colonialism trying to impact on Venezuela? Because they've recently, well, in recent years, discovered lots of oil there, I think. I could be wrong.
So Venezuela is the 3rd largest supplier of US oil needs after Canada, which is number 1, and Mexico, which is number 2. And Venezuela was a country that shared its oil wealth with its citizens, much like you see in current day United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates shares its oil wealth with its own Emirati citizens. Today, that government under Chavez, that it's gone. It's gone. Venezuela is impoverished. The CIA installed puppet regimes are keeping the money for themselves and for the global corporations. The people there are not, they don't get free education anymore, and they don't get the health care that they used to get. It's turning into Nigeria, where just a faction of the people get the share in the oil wealth, and the rest of the people don't. Under Chavez, Venezuela wasn't like that. It's terrible what has happened to Venezuela. But what I was pointing to was the role that oil plays in empire, especially for the Pentagon. And I was first alerted to this 40 years ago when I was in the Air Force in AWACS. I was told that oil in the Middle East, that's what AWACS was doing there, watching everybody from the sky. That oil does not belong to the Arabs who live above it. It belongs to the West. Oil is the West lifeblood. That's how it was explained to me. And then the US dollar, it was taken off the gold standard, I think more than 50 years ago. So it's not backed by yellow gold anymore. What it's backed by is black gold, Arab tea, or Venezuelan tea, oil. The Pentagon makes sure no oil sales are conducted in any currency other than the US dollar. If you try to conduct oil sales in a different currency, such as the euro, you won't live very long. I'm thinking of Saddam Hussein. If you suggest selling oil in a new Arab dinar in connection with 6 other Arab oil-rich countries, you won't live very long. I'm thinking of Muammar Gaddafi. Right now, somebody's trying to sell oil in rubles. What's the Soviet currency? And I hear he's very sickly right now and might not live very long.
Okay, thank you. I'll let other people come in because it looks like we're coming to the end of this session. So thank you ever so much. It's been a really interesting talk. Thank you.
Welcome, Imogen.
Thank you. We have another question. So, from a global South perspective, do you think the rise of fascism in the continent can also be seen as a colonial legacy?
I definitely think it was instigated. That was what my whole talk was suggesting, that the divisions, divide and conquer, is a British tactic. And that when Gandhi began to preach pan-Indianism, a one India, that was a threat to the old divide and conquer tactic preferred by what we call British Empire, which is really just 3% of the people that had the vote for up until 1867. And he was assassinated, they say by a fellow Hindu extremist. And yes, he did fire the shots, but why did he fire the shots? Under what conditions did he believe he was shooting? Anyway, that served the divide and conquer. the rhetorics that divided the people into different camps and to become distrustful of each other. Whereas that there's actually, before British Empire, there were centuries of actually people living together. In the areas of the Punjab that I'm studying prior to partition, you see that before partition, Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus were living together. I mean, Lahore, the mayor of Lahore, under so-called Mughal rule, was a Sikh. The voters elected the mayor, a Sikh guy, to be a mayor. They didn't have these divisions that we see today, and those are stirred up by wordsmiths with, you know, who benefit from people being divided. In the United States today, polarization is manufactured, especially in electoral politics. This WWE, you know, fake wrestling, international wrestling, good guy, bad guy, two sides of the same coin, one party system with two faces. It's manufactured, this polarization. And at the end of the day, it's always a Democrat and Republican that takes office. It's never any of the others. It's never a libertarian or a green. You don't even know that there are normally at least 4 presidential candidates in every presidential election. For at least the past 50 years, you don't know this, because mass media, which is controlled by a mere 6 billionaires, Rupert Murdoch being one of them, they don't tell you. Next question.
We don't have any question unless if anyone from the unless if any attendee has any question. No, I can't see any hands. So we don't.
So again, I would talk about the rise of fascism as being manufactured. We have to be concerned that fascism is being manufactured right along with polarization.
Thank you so much, Robert. It doesn't look like we have any question, and I think we are running out of time. So
Yeah,
thank you so much for
2
the
minutes.
session. Yeah,
2 minutes.
I have
Oh.
I'm gonna send this. So yeah, I have sent the details of today's session and other sessions, as well as if you have any questions regarding today's session, I've included the link, the email, Robert's email, in the chat, as well as if you have any question regarding the whole decolonization series, please feel free to email Mel. The email and all the contact details are in the chat. Thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Stella.